All right, 11th gen is here. We've already done a review of the 11900K with the stocks out of the box settings, with all of the, almost dropped that, that's a heavy board, with all of the limits in place. Today we're gonna take the ROG Maximus 13 Apex board, which is a specific board designed for overclocking. And we're gonna see just how far we can actually push the 11900K today with just a modest 360 AIO. Because there's some things I want to test on here. There are some things I wasn't happy with the 11900K or the 10900K, and we're going to see if the 11900K kind of alleviates any of those issues that I had in the past. Also, too, a special thanks to ASUS for providing today's motherboard and sponsoring today's video.
We interrupt this video to bring you a special message from iFixit. Bring you iFixit by the makers of iFixit. Got a crappy graphics card? That's okay. Fix it with iFixit. iFixit has all the tools you need to make your life better. Got a dirty phone screen? That's okay. You can fix it with iFixit. Thirsty? That's okay. Fix that thirst with iFixit. Refreshing. Use iFixit to fix your computer or even just upgrade it. Cool. iFixit can fix anything, even this and this. Got a problem with your friend? Fix him too with iFixit. He'll appreciate it. Guaranteed.
Disclaimer, iFixit does not actually cause spills, fix friends, fix cars, fix tires, or fix things that are not designed to be fixed with iFixit tools. But that's okay, because iFixit is cool anyway.
To find out more, click the link in the description below.
Yeah, iFixit. Explosion.
All right, so once again, a huge thanks to ASUS for sending us this Apex motherboard for today's video. So let's talk about what makes an overclocking motherboard, because I know a lot of people might hear that and say, Jay, if it has the BIOS settings to overclock, it's an overclocking motherboard. Technically, yes, but you have to back up those settings with hardware that's designed to deal with the extra abuse. For instance, the extra abuse is going to be specifically generated in power draw and heat. Those two are very much related. So you might notice the heat sinks on this guy are freaking beefy. This is a nice, thick heat sink, both on the VRMs and the MOSFETs and chokes. So as you're creating more heat by pushing the voltage and the frequency higher, you can take care of that heat and have a big heat sink able to pull that heat away from those components, keeping their lifespan high. A lot of people are usually worried about breaking their CPU when they overclock really far, but what they don't understand is they can often break the power delivery to the CPU if the cooling isn't standard enough. Another thing you'll notice is there's only two slots for memory right here, channel A and channel B. Remember, the mainstream Intel platform, AMD as well, are dual channel motherboards. What that means is they're only gonna have two sets of channels, channel A and channel B. If you see 4 sticks or 4 DIMM slots, that doesn't mean it's a 4 channel. It means that there's 2 slots of memory per channel, allowing you to get more capacity without having to run giant memory sticks. So what this gets you is a better chance of overclocking your memory and less strain on your memory controller, because having to split the memory channels with having 2 slots per channel is actually harder on the memory controller. So what you'll find, and remember, that is located on the CPU, so that's all extra strain on the CPU if you try and push 4 sticks of memory to their max speeds. So one of the things I'm gonna test here today too is this is my Crucial Ballistics Max. These are 4400 DIMMs, I believe. These are DIMMs that I couldn't get running on my 10900K at their rated speeds. No matter how much I tried to adjust the memory controller or deal with overvolting the memory controller and all the sub voltages that are required to do that, when you enable XMP, it'll often just set the memory frequency and the voltage for the frequency or for the memory to their rated specs. But there are memory controllers on the CPU that need to be adjusted as well. And oftentimes straight out of the box with really high memory speeds over like 4200, those don't work without going in there and really tweaking it. So I'm curious as to if on the 11900K, if we can actually get our 4400 megahertz DIMMs to run at 4400 megahertz. Now, something else that's also nice on here is you'll see we've got 2 8-pin EPS right here. This is just giving redundant power to the CPU, because when you start overclocking, the voltage draw becomes exponentially higher. So if you start to pull like crazy, like we're not gonna be doing that today. We could still only use 1 if we wanted because we're on water. But if we were doing LN2 and we were going for like 6 gigahertz or higher, you'd be surprised how much voltage and amps this CPU can draw, which is why they give you 2 8-pin headers. That way you can have plenty of power delivery without starting to strain one set of, or one EPS power plug. So you might notice that most motherboards will have like an 8-pin and maybe a 4-pin, the 4-pin just being a supplemental. This is designed for giving you as much power as possible to your CPU so that you don't run out of power before you run out of your potential CPU headroom. Other design things on this motherboard here that are just, that also make it obvious that it's an overclocking motherboard. One 16X PCIe Gen 4, one 8X PCIe Gen 4, and then one 4X. So this is not even gonna be like technically an SLI motherboard, which doesn't matter, right? SLI is dead. Even if you could run 2 cards on here if you wanted, but you're gonna be running both of them at 8X, which is still plenty of bandwidth, especially a PCIe Gen 4 with these 2 slots. But remember, this motherboard is definitely designed for CPU overclocking. The chipset heatsink on here too might be amongst the thickest I've seen on any motherboard to date yet. A couple other honorable mentions here is you have different dip switches and stuff, so you can turn on and off PCIe lanes. You can turn on and off various overvolt settings. Also got these really interesting offset angled SATA plugs. I'm kind of wondering if those would impact each other if you had all of them occupied, because you've got a total of 8 of them here. And then you've got this little plexi ROG piece back here. Be careful. If you're not careful, I have a feeling that could break. Something else we have on here are a ton of fan headers. We have 10 PWM fan headers on here, so you could have plenty of fans hooked up to this, again, for cooling. And then one of the ASUS features that I'm a huge fan of, and I've got quite a few of these now, are the DIMM.2 for your M.2 drives. You can hook 2 M.2s onto here, and then this goes into this slot right next to the RAM. I've had people ask me, like, what is that slot? That doesn't match any RAM notches. That's true, that's because it's for the DIMM.2. I've actually got our M.2 underneath the cover right here, which is something I kind of want to point out too before we move on. This cover actually has thermal pads on both sides of it. They'll have the M.2 on one side, and then the controller on the other. And people, or not the M.2, but the chips on one side. And a lot of companies become so concerned, it's pulling it off, with cooling the chips, they forget about the controller. Now see, we've got some stuff on the back happening here, and we've got our controller module, I'll show you on the front right there. We've got a controller module and our chips on one side, and then you might have an M.2 that has chips on both sides. In fact, this one has some on the back right there. So we have a thermal pad on the bottom right here, and a thermal pad on the cover, and it's held down by the same screw that holds down the cover. So no more having to fumble with tiny little screws and losing them and stuff. So that's our setup. We're gonna go ahead now, get the thing booted up, get my cooler on here, and then we're gonna see kind of in real time as I go through some of the overclock settings, whether or not it will boot, where it's gonna boot at, remove the limits and all that stuff. And then we'll compare them to the numbers that we did on our initial review of the 11900K, and we'll see what kind of gains that we got and where we sort of cap out. All right, so this is our first boot into the BIOS. We haven't started playing with any of the overclocking yet. You can see here the CPU target mode is 5300 megahertz. That's the single core. AVX frequency is also 5300. So you can see how there's no AVX offset. Target DRAM frequency is 2666, and then the cache is 4100. That's actually a pretty good speed cache. You can see right here though, if you actually look at what things are running at, the memory is at 2133, the capacity is 32 gigs, so we have 2 16 gig sticks in there. Multi-core enhancement is sent to auto, let BIOS optimize. But multi-core enhancement is where it lets the BIOS kind of override the Intel limits, which is like the thermal velocity boost, which is how long it will ramp up to those high frequencies for before it comes back down. I think default 56 seconds. So you can leave that at auto, which is gonna by default want to turn those off. Or in our case here, we're just gonna go ahead and go to enabled, which is remove all limits. That seems a little counterintuitive. Turn it on for off. But anyway, that's what we're gonna do here. So what I'm gonna do right now is I'm gonna go ahead and just reboot right now with those limits removed. I'm gonna go back into the BIOS, and I'm just gonna start by trying to enable our XMP profile to see if this system will even boot. What I was dealing with the 10900K, which just frustrated the absolute crap out of me, is the fact that I've got memory sticks that are over 5000 megahertz also, that I just could not get to work on 10th gen, period. And let's just go ahead and go right to XMP1. So that's great, because what that is saying, the base clock, everything in your system, the PCIe clock, the memory clock, the CPU clock, the chipset clock, everything is based off of the B clock or base clock. If you make that 101, because everything is a ratio or a factor of the base clock, then you start getting those weird numbers where RAM is like 4332, and you're like, why is it so weird? And you notice your B clock's no longer 100. So what this is saying is it will adjust the B clock, and then it will change the ratios of other items to keep them from being affected by any sort of base clock change. That is something I've always kind of complained about, and I'm really happy to see that it now tells you that it's gonna try and bring things back to as close to the ratio as possible so that you don't start getting weird boot errors. 4403. Wow. Now, will it go to Windows? Okay, first and foremost, I have to give 11th gen a little bit of credit. The 10th gen never did that. The 10th gen, I could never just say XMP turn on, 4400 megahertz on the RAM, and have it go. Maybe before we even start overclocking anything else, we should see if the 5000s will work. Okay, this is our Ballistics RAM 5100. I thought they were 52, they're 5100 DIMMs. Let's just see if it'll even get into the BIOS. If this does it, then I will be so happy. Even Black Ice at home can't run this memory. No way! Wait, did it apply it? Because the nice thing about ASUS motherboards is it will be like, it didn't work, and so we reverted back. 5102! Wow. All right, so before we go ahead and do our CPU test, now we need to see how much we can actually overclock the CPU, because we've now pushed the memory controller probably to its limit, or pretty close to it. I'm really curious now as to what we can do for our CPU overclock. Do I dare try sync all cores? So here's the thing with the 10900K, having 10 cores, 20 threads. That's a lot of focused heat on the size substrate that they have for the CPU. That's not changed since like LGA 775 in terms of the actual size of the chip itself. But we have 2 cores and 4 threads less, which means there's going to be less heat in there versus the 10900K. I want to see if we can just lock everything. Sync all cores, jeez. Without even touching voltage. I'm a little concerned that it's gonna add way too much voltage. Voltage is 1.6. Let's send it. Oh, the whole system just crashed. Okay, I didn't think it was gonna go. All right, here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna do the AI overclock. To be honest, it's like manual overclocking these days, unless you're trying to go for like crazy limits, is just kind of, I mean, allow me to demonstrate. So I had sync all cores on here, right? Now we're just gonna do AI optimized. Because here's the thing, you might have seen, it brought the 5.3 down to 5.2, but it brought the 4.7, 4.8 all core up to 5.0. So I feel like with most titles these days in terms of games utilizing multi-core and more than one, and just about everything in our CPU suite using multi-core, except for the buttons we push that say single core, we're gonna see an uplift even with the 100 megahertz drop on the single core. 72, 73. Oh God, the temps are great. Look at that, 60s and 70s. We got more headroom in there. Now here's the thing, even if we match our frequency of the 10900K, there is about 9 to 10% IPC improvement in 11th gen versus 10th gen. So we're gonna see an uplift. This should be like 62, maybe 63. We went from a 5902 to a 6237 so far by just flipping some switches in the BIOS. Okay, so this is where we can go in here and adjust. Oh yeah, see, when you remove the limits, 56 seconds is now our power limit window. And then we can pull 4,095 watts if we wanted. That's obviously not gonna happen. But time window, there. So we removed that, we've set that up to 448 seconds now, up from 56. Because what that 56 seconds shows right there is that after 56 seconds of constant load, it's gonna drop the clocks. And so we can disable that technically by making it 448 seconds. So now we're just gonna do a manual mode. I wanna lock the voltage to where I want it. We're gonna do 1.4, which is a lot, but it's not 1.6. So it locked up as soon as I hit go again. Another clock watchdog timeout, which is obviously a overclocking error. It's starting to look like just leaving it on AI optimized. It's kind of the way to go. All right, so what I tried on this one here is I've gone in and set the single core to 5.3, and then I set the all core to 5.1, essentially. So I'm looking at the behavior here. We got 5.2, 5.2. So as soon as I hit this load right here, if it doesn't crash, then we should see this go to 5.1 all core. 5.135 because of our B clock offset. Okay, there we go. And our temps, 80C on the package, 70s and 82. Okay, so these temps are still perfectly reasonable considering the fact that we do not have some crazy cooling solution. It's just an AIO. Let's go ahead and let's put this through the paces and see how it does. 10900K versus 1100K versus 1100K overclocked. All right, so you guys see the way that the results actually compared to the 10900K. The only thing we didn't have a 10900K on was actually our handbrake test, which I have a feeling would have still beat the 1100K because it's very multi-threaded. Remember, as we compare to the 10900K, we're trying to make up for a 2-core, 4-thread deficit with clock speed. Now let's talk about the overclock experience between the two CPUs and then 11th gen's overclocking in general. We already showed you guys, I was never on 10th gen capable of getting the 4400 DIMMs to run at their full speed, let alone the 5100 DIMMs, and they're running out of the box by clicking XMP, and that's it. Completely stable in all of our tests, no memory errors, no memory crashing, no tweaking whatsoever, just put it in, hit the XMP, and off it goes, which has been amazing, because I was starting to really get kind of discouraged with these DIMMs over time because I thought maybe something's wrong with them, but you know, just clearly it just had to do with the fact that the 10900K and then the memory controller, and then with the high clock speeds with just being pushed, I think just too far. Now, some of these tests right here are gonna benefit from the higher memory. Premiere uses extra memory, obviously when we're doing CPU rendering. When it comes to things like Geekbench and all of that, you'll see some uplift in the higher memory speeds, but the 5100 is not actually carrying the score. What's really carrying the score here is the fact that you saw in the overclocking section of this video that I was able to get a 5.1 gigahertz all-core, which by the way, I could not get to work very well on the 10900K without overheating. And we've got a 5.3 gigahertz 2-core or two thread overclock. So what that means is typically out of the box, it'll just allow one core to go up to the 5.3. But as sometimes cores overlap each other when they're being utilized, if they overlap each other for too long, it can bring down those core clocks down closer to the 5.0 to 5.1, except for the way we did the manual overclock allowed it to allow 2 cores to go up to 5.3. And it's actually going faster than that because of the XMP's 101 megahertz base clock means that we're actually getting like 5,335 megahertz, and those extra 35 megahertz actually do make a little bit of a difference. But in a few of these tests, you can see we actually surpassed the 10900K with its stock velocity boost and all of that with 4 threads less. Now, does that mean that I'm saying you should go get 1100K? No, I'm saying that when it comes to your multi-threaded workloads, if it's something that you know is highly utilizing multi-threads, the 10900K can overclock as well. It's a bit more picky and it's a lot more heat. It's something that you need to consider. However, the 11900K with this improved IPC and really easy overclocking, especially with a lot of the ASUS features built into this board like we showed you in the BIOS section of this video, it was actually really quite easy to get up to these, you know, crazy scores. Now, I want to try playing around with this in the future, a little bit better cooling because, and maybe even an ice bucket, because of the fact that we did see during the handbrake section of this test, the cores and the package did reach 100C. Now, we didn't actually end up running the increased thermal limiter on this because I didn't want to cause any damage to the CPU. So at 100C, it probably was clocking down closer to 5 gigahertz. Handbrake ran for about 23 minutes, which means that that was a lot of load over time. None of the other tests actually exceeded about 90, 91C. So you can see the handbrake test was very, very difficult. Now, that was only one test in our particular suite that we were using here that actually over time was enough to saturate the amount of fluid that's inside the AIO. That's why I said if we were going with a custom loop with a high volume of water, it would take longer for that water to warm up. Doesn't mean the water wouldn't get as hot, it just means it would take longer to get there. Unless we can actually start chilling the water and bringing the temperature down below ambient, then we would be able to see better temperatures. But the reason why I bring up the temperatures is the fact that 8-core 16 threads was getting us 100C in handbrake. The 10900K, I guarantee, would have been hotter than that, sooner than that. And if you go back to our 10 series overclocking video, you could see that we were having a hell of a time getting 10 cores and 20 threads stable and tame when it comes to temperatures with even a 360 AIO. Now, when we do our extreme overclocking and stuff, we almost always had it hooked up to water and whatnot, or like ice water, just to try and keep the temps under control. But again, this is what happens when you have the substrate size and the IHS, or the integrated heat spreader, not giving you more volume to try and dissipate the heat and move it away from the die. Staying on that really small substrate gives you really focused heat, which is why you were seeing in some of these tests, you know, the temperatures can get pretty warm. It's also important to note I did not do any sort of voltage tuning. This was it using its own logic for voltage tuning, which we already know is a bit aggressive because it wants to try and sort of brute force voltage to make sure it's going to have the most stability at the sacrifice of temperature and potential throttling. Now, if I was to go in there and actually spend, you know, hours or even days tuning the voltage, I'm pretty sure I could have gotten those temperatures down under 100°C and stay there and not have a problem, even while running well over 5 gigahertz. But it's kind of nice to see in the last 2 generations of CPUs, at least from Intel, that we've been able to see 5 gigahertz plus, which is where it seemed like for a solid decade there, the mythical 5 gigahertz number was going to be impossible. Clearly isn't true, because now we are well on our way to 5.5 here, probably in the future. So there you go. That's our overclocking experience with the 11900K. Most of it was automated, and then we did some fine tuning on top of that. And that's all thanks to the Asus Maximus 13. Maximus 13. I remember when Maximus like 4 was out. Anyway, moving on. The Maximus 13 Apex board. I'll put a link to it down in the description below. Once again, a huge thank you to Asus for sponsoring today's video and allowing us to kind of go in here and really push the CPU. I didn't want to blow it up. I didn't, thank God. But if I had, fortunately, they would have been here to support us with another CPU, but I don't like blowing things up unnecessarily. We'll probably do that in another video where we see just how far it can really go when we start doing some extreme cooling. Anyway, guys, thanks for watching. Hope this video has taught you something about 11th gen. And all of this performance uplift in terms of IPC and frequency will also translate to better frame FPS, which is going to be our next focus when it comes to 11th gen. Thanks for watching, guys. And as always, we'll see you in the next one.